Hello and welcome to the Friday, March 19th, 2021 edition of On Iowa Politics. Hi, I'm James Lynch of the Cedar Rapids Gazette. And with me this week are Tom Barton of the Quad City Times. Good morning, Tom.
Good morning, James.
Amie Rivers of the Waterloo-Cedar Falls Courier. Good morning, Amie.
Good morning, James.
Aaron Murphy, Lee Newspaper Statehouse Bureau Chief. Good morning, Aaron.
Good morning.
You can find us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe to On Iowa Politics wherever you find your podcast. First up this week, don't run. Our friends over at the Des Moines Register asked Iowans about their elected leaders. The results were interesting. A majority of Iowans said they don't want either Senator Chuck Grassley or Governor Kim Reynolds to run for re-election in 2022. It doesn't seem like a vote of support or confidence. But what should we make of those results? Grassley has been quick to point out that in 2013, the Register poll found that Iowans didn't want Governor Terry Branstad to run again. He ran and coasted to a sixth term. And the poll gave us no indication of who Iowans would prefer to run, but I'm sure a future Iowa poll will give us that answer. Amie, as a whole, we love to hate our politicians. So should we surmise that Grassley and Reynolds are in trouble? Or after a year of bad, depressing news, we just don't like anybody?
We never like politicians, right? It's the values that they purport to hold that we like. So even if we don't like Grassley, if Grassley's the one on the ticket, right? Like, you're gonna see Republicans vote for him. Let's remember that in some states, who have had politicians die and still win elections, people are really just like, who's the standard bearer? Like, maybe I don't like you as a person, but are you the standard bearer for my party, which is for my values, which is what I want? So I think they're probably taking this with a grain of salt. Now, it's totally different consideration if there's a strong candidate in the primary. So if you got the candidates that are coming up, like for Grassley, Jim Carlin, I'm not sure who for Reynolds quite yet, but if they really get a strong contender with some name recognition who is able to sort of flip the script and say, here's how I would do things differently, and even more pander to your values, maybe not pander, but accept your values, maybe you see somebody get taken down in primary. Stranger things have happened.
Yeah. Although it's pretty hard for me to imagine anybody seriously challenging Grassley, that other Republicans would take that candidate seriously. I think that would almost fall into sort of sacrilege territory for, I know Jim Carlin, state senator from Sioux City, has announced he's running whether or not Grassley runs for re-election. But I certainly haven't seen a groundswell of support among Iowa Republicans getting on board that campaign.
No. We are a year and a half out, however.
We are. Is the calculation different for the governor's race? I don't know that she's as bulletproof as Chuck Grassley.
She's younger. I think,
everybody is.
That's true. But I think a little bit, there's a different record to run on. There's a whole state that she was trying to, help with the coronavirus effort on, that obviously Grassley wasn't a super integral part of. So yeah, there's definitely different calculations there. Yeah,
it seems like she's probably been affected more by handling of the pandemic than Grassley. There's a difference between legislating and executing, and she's really on the front line in that regard.
And to that point, she has people to the right of her who are upset with her handling of the pandemic, not just people to the left. So does that mean she's going to get a primary challenge? I don't know, but to Amy's point, to your question, it's maybe a little more likely than Grassley because of the pandemic, because there were people on the conservative right who were upset about, when churches were closed, for example, early on, or businesses or things about that. Mm-hmm. So she actually, took bullets from both sides on that thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tom, Grassley seemed pretty unconcerned about the poll that what was it, like 55% of Iowans didn't want him to run again. Did he, in responding to that, did he tip his hand about his plans?
Yeah, he might have asked what his considerations would be if he chose not to run for another term. Grassley said, "If that's a decision I've made, you would know it by now." He went on to say, "So this is speculation, and I'm not going to speculate about anything." So Grassley, who has served in elected office continuously since 1959, when he was elected to the Iowa legislature, filed a statement of candidacy with the Federal Election Commission for the 2022 election earlier this month, but declined to say whether he's going to be running for re-election.
Yeah, I'm probably the only one here who was alive in 1959. So, but I wasn't following Iowa politics at that time. So I didn't vote in that election.
I was going to ask if you covered it.
No. Not in 1959, no. So, I mean, I think this raises a question. I mean, if Iowans, including a lot of Republicans, are saying they don't want to see Reynolds and Grassley run, it raises the question: who do they want to see run? And I don't hear a lot of names being mentioned in either race. I mean, people aren't talking about, in the past we saw Bob Vanderplaats, challenging Terry Branstad. They tried to control the lieutenant governor position, that sort of thing. I'm not even hearing that there's a movement out there to put somebody else on the ticket. I have to think that it's just people fed up, saying, hey, we've had the same people over and over.
The throw out the bums vote, right?
Yeah. And so I guess we'll have to wait and see if somebody looks at the poll and says, like, aha, this is my chance. On the Democratic side, Aaron, some Democrats have lodged an effort to draft Michael Franklin, the Northwest Iowa native and retired three-star admiral, ran in a five-way race for the U.S. Senate nomination in 2020, finished second to Teresa Greenfield with 25% of the vote. Is he the front runner, and is he a serious challenge to lawmaker for life, Chuck Grassley?
Well, I'll answer those separately. I suppose he's the front runner in the sense that nobody has announced, and he's the only one who people are making an actual defined effort to recruit. So, in so much as there is a front runner, I guess he would be the front runner. There's a long time to go for this, and I get the sense that some candidates are kind of waiting in the weeds to see what Chuck Grassley decides, to decide whether they're going to challenge him or not. And also, you've got Democrats that there's two races, as we've talked about, and Democrats who might want to run for one or the other, are probably waiting to read the tea leaves on both of those races. So anyways, the point being, this field is going to be in flux and largely unknown, I think, for a long time. We're not going to see anything solidifying anytime soon here. Would he challenge Chuck Grassley? I don't know. I mean, that's going to be such an uphill climb for any Democrat. But I will say that he was well thought of in that Democratic primary that you mentioned when he ran 2 years ago. He did pretty well, finishing second. A lot of Democrats really liked him, thought he did well, thought he has a really good resume with his military experience and his kind of insight into foreign policy. So I think he would be there's no doubt in my mind he would be a legitimate, tough candidate in that primary, depending on who else ran. So I think that is easier to say. Would he challenge Chuck Grassley? I mean, like we just said, Chuck, and I've written a couple times now, Chuck Grassley's been winning Iowa elections since James Dean was on the big screen. So it's not easy to beat Chuck Grassley for anybody, obviously. But I think Michael Franklin would be a strong Democratic candidate.
Are we likely to see sort of a battle within the Democratic Party between the more progressive forces and maybe sort of traditional forces. We've already seen some response to the news about Michael Frank, and people asking, well, isn't he a Republican? And for a lot of the woke Democrats, he's not progressive enough. And we saw in 2020 that some of those folks didn't think that Teresa Greenfield was progressive enough.
Right.
So, are we just? It's just the first shot being fired in that primary race.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if we see a candidate in that lane, because we've seen them in the last couple elections. However, that said, they have not been successful in Iowa in Democratic primaries. Kimberly Graham is an example in the and I feel like there's one more that's slipping my mind. But in some recent Senate and Democratic and gubernatorial primaries here, those candidates have been around, and they haven't been successful. Now, Bernie did well in Iowa twice at the presidential level, but that's a different beast than running a state campaign. So I don't doubt that. I would be surprised, honestly, if we don't see a candidate of that brand in this primary. Whether they're any more successful than the last few who have tried remains to be seen.
One of the complaints Democrats had about the 2020 race against Senator Joni Ernst was that Senator Chuck Schumer and the DNC stacked the deck for Teresa Greenfield, just as they did for Patty Judge when she ran against Chuck Grassley. Have they learned their lesson? Are they likely to stay out of the race in 2022? Tom or Amie?
I don't know. I find it incredibly hard that the DNC is going to stay out of this if they see that they have got a good shot at unseating Chuck Grassley for the first time. If they're looking at some of these early polls that show him to be vulnerable, it's hard to see Washington, D.C. staying out of this one, because this would be a huge seat for them. I don't think Chuck Schumer is going to stay out of this one.
Yeah, with everything they have at stake, right, Tom? They go into this election with literally a tie in the Senate, meaning one seat, a net one seat loss, and they lose their majority. So I think Tom's absolutely right. It's hard to see them staying on the sidelines. Now, it's a fair question, though, and Iowa Democrats are probably view this maybe a little differently, given the recent history that you mentioned, and not just with this last race, Jim, but with the last time we had an open seat race, and the field was cleared for Bruce Braley, who was then beaten by Joni Ernst, who came out of a very tough primary. At least this time there was a primary. They didn't clear the field for Teresa Greenfield, but she was clearly the favored and supported candidate by the national establishment. So it will be interesting. I'm with Tom. I'm assuming they'll be involved. It'll be interesting to see to what degree they get involved. And the recent track record is not great. Now the fair question is, did Iowa lose those races because of the DNC pick candidate, or did they just lose because Republicans had better, the national atmosphere was better for Republicans, right? Turnout was better, that's fair to ask too. It's not necessarily just because of who the DNC picked that Iowa lost those races, but it's worth about considering in the whole great picture.
And it's hard to believe that they would pick anybody but a centrist candidate, right? So as we're talking about progressive candidates, if you're looking to go up against Grassley, who, you can argue sort of hews to that more of a central Republican. He's not like a super a Jim Carlin Republican, if you will, which is why Jim Carlin's running against him. But that's why I think the DNC is really looking at Iowa and saying we need to back a centrist candidate, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon, particularly if they think they've really got a shot unseating Grassley.
On the other hand, if assuming Grassley runs, you look around the country and the Democrats, their pickup chances probably are better in other states where they have open seat races than taking on an entrenched incumbent. So I guess it's, the old question, where do you spend your resources? Do you spend it on those open seat races where you start with a 50-50 chance of a pickup, I guess, as opposed to even what are the odds in Iowa, incumbents getting reelected by 80-90% of the time. So where do you spend your money? And I think it's a little bit different than it was in 2020 when in the Ernst race. It was her first time on the ballot, her first reelection race. And that's, your best chance of defeating an incumbent, I think. It's, I don't think Grassley hasn't made any fatal mistakes, at least so far. But so I think, the Schumer and others might look at this and say, okay, we do enough to cause him to go out, break a sweat, but we're going to look at these open seat races and put our resources there and hopefully pick up the seats we need to have complete control of the Senate.
Yeah. I think Grassley's health is more likely to change his status than anything he says or does at this point. That's a really good point, Jim. We kind of talk about that with blinders on and just thinking about Iowa, but you're absolutely right. The national map may dictate, the DNC, we're going to put more resources and focus here to this state and this state and this state, to the point where maybe they don't feel the need to have a big thumb on the scales in Iowa and can kind of let Iowa Democrats do their thing.
Well, in 2020, Iowa didn't show any signs of moving to the left. I think it's probably true that Iowa appears less purple than it was in 2016 or 2018. So, it's, what's the most fertile ground? Where are you going to get the best yield, you might say?
Yep.
Moving along here, everybody gets a vaccine. Governor Kim Reynolds announced this week that April 5th, every Iowa adult will be eligible for COVID-19 vaccine, which is certainly good news.
Yay!
Yeah, especially for our younger Iowans. Amie, the vaccination rate in Iowa continues to run slightly ahead of the national average because, of course, out here in Lake Wolfron country, we're all above average. How significant is this development, assuming the supply matches the demand? Are we reaching a turning point in the pandemic?
I hope so. I mean, all indications are that it's still really difficult to find an appointment to get a vaccine. It's not necessarily true of other parts of the country. I think, maybe it's just Iowans are just being really rational and going to get the vaccine more than others. And that's why it's still difficult. Maybe it's that we're just not opening up enough pharmacies. The other thing is, in recent weeks, we've seen our vaccine allocation come down. We've actually gotten less vaccine. Now they keep saying they're going to ramp that up. So I'm trying to be optimistic about it, but all of these optimistic predictions are also really dependent on if we can actually get that manufactured. So I'm hoping so. I can't wait to get mine, but I'm certainly not going to skip the line or try to, bring a pack of cigarettes and pretend I'm eligible this time. They don't check. But yeah, I hope so. I think it is a significant development, and I really hope that we can go into this summer all vaccinated if we want to be.
Aaron, you have been following this, the governor's role in the pandemic response closely, and certainly she's come in for a lot of criticism, and from people who have questioned how she's handling this, including the people of, on the right who, as you mentioned, didn't like her mask proclamation, didn't like the business limitations, those sorts of things, limitations on, worship services, those sorts of things. Can she get past this pandemic fast enough to preserve her political career? to last long enough to appoint herself to the U.S. Senate when Chuck Grassley retires?
I'm sure within the walls of the governor's offices, that is a sentiment. Like the sooner we can get this thing in the rearview mirror, the better. Politically speaking, obviously, I hope, and I'm sure we all feel that way from a public health perspective. But yeah, I'm sure. The governor and her staff are looking forward to the day when press conferences are about bills and what the president said and, what she's going to do on the campaign trail versus vaccine rollouts and, nursing home outbreaks and all that kind of stuff. This particular revelation gets us closer to that, certainly. And to Amy's point, the appointments will continue to be a thing that the state and local officials will have to address. But I think Amie also nailed it, that's a good problem to have, right? I mean, that people are seeking these things, and Iowa is turning around its vaccine doses. We're at somewhere around an 86% rate of the vaccine doses that they getting those out and getting shots into arms. So it is still at this point a matter, like Amie said, a matter of that supply and getting more hopefully soon here from the federal government. So that will continue to be an issue as demand continues to outweigh supply. But the fact that they expect to get enough to be able to open that up to everybody, and more people will be getting the vaccine, and that should keep bringing those numbers down. And that makes this whole thing less and less of a problem. It's not going to go completely away, but it's going to be safe to say it's going to be far less a big deal than it was just a couple of months ago. So it does feel like a big turn of the corner here, and hopefully it is. Hopefully we don't have, don't end up going in reverse for any number of reasons. Hopefully these variants don't have any extra teeth to them. Hopefully people are still doing the right things as we get down the road here. And all those numbers that are going down, keep going down, and we can all move past this thing, public health wise, political wise, podcast topic wise, move on to other things.
Yeah, I guess it's probably fortunate that Iowa isn't a spring break destination.
What do you mean?
Okoboji, other than Okoboji, baby.
That's right.
Tom, circling back to our first topic, given the criticism that Reynolds and Grassley and most incumbents have taken over the course of the pandemic, do challengers start with an advantage in 2022 just because they're not an incumbent?
I think because of that criticism, Democrats have a good shot at potentially unseating Reynolds and Grassley in 2022, maybe a better shot than they've had in previous election cycles. But I don't think that they'll necessarily have an advantage. I mean, Democrats still have a lot of ground to make up in Iowa. They lost 2 congressional seats in the last election. They lost seats in the Iowa House. And Reynolds and Grassley both have a fundraising advantage. And although, Grassley has declining job approval and favorability numbers, according to the last Iowa poll, he remains a formidable candidate. He's earned the respect for maintaining close ties with his constituents, making a point to visit all 99 of Iowa's counties every year, for example. I think he had $1.8 million in the bank at the end of 2020. And I would just say this also. In 2016, a pair of polls released shortly before Democrat Patty Judge, a former Iowa lieutenant governor and state agriculture secretary, shortly after she announced her campaign to run for that U.S. Senate seat, the pair of polls showed Grassley in a virtual statistical tie with Patty Judge. And Grassley ended up winning by 24 points. So, I mean, take that for what you will. I think that we got to take the Iowa poll with a grain of salt. It's still early. and yeah, be going off of what Amie said earlier, with Grassley being kind of more of a kind of a centrist Republican, he hasn't made any fatal mistakes. That still makes him a affordable challenger, and it's still going to be an uphill climb for a Democrat. With Reynolds and the criticisms over her handling of the pandemic, it may be less of an uphill battle or an uphill climb for a Democrat. But, the thing that she has to fall back on is, looking at the financial health and strength of Iowa, during this pandemic, and the fact that unlike other states, Iowa still maintains a fairly healthy fiscal position. I think that's a strong argument for her to make, and especially a strong argument for her to make in Iowa, which in recent elections is less purple, and in a state where you've seen voters kind of gravitate toward that kind of conservative populist message, that we saw in the 2020 election.
The other thing I'll just add to that is remember, for everybody, we're up to our eyeballs in this right now. And as I look at my watch here, it is March of 2021. We are 14 months from the primary, much less the general election. Yeah. Assuming, as we just talked about, knock on wood behind me here, everything continues to go the way it looks like, and we hope so. This is going to be a distant memory by the time people are casting ballots. I'm sure it will come up on the campaign trail. Don't get me wrong. I'm sure the Democratic opponent will try to make Governor Reynolds' COVID pandemic response an issue. So it'll be discussed on the campaign, but it'll be a distant memory for voters at that point too. Again, hopefully, God help me. If it's not the case, we got to burn this podcast.
I think it'll be more of an issue in the primary.
Right. And that's assuming she gets a strong primary challenge.
It could very well be. Yeah. That, like you said, she'll get a challenge from the right, the people who didn't like the way she, locked things down, which was pretty gentle compared to other states.
Right.
But, well, if she gets a primary challenger, we'll talk about it on a future edition of On Iowa Politics. If you enjoyed the podcast today, tell a friend and subscribe to us wherever you find your podcast. Send fan mail to podcast@thegazette.com. You can find us on the homepages of the Quad City Times, Sioux City Journal, Muscatine Journal, Mason City Globe Gazette, Waterloo-Cedar Falls Courier, and the Cedar Rapids Gazette. Imperfekt will take us out. If you know an Iowa band or musician who should be on our show, send us a sound file and subscribe to On Iowa Politics on iTunes and Stitcher or wherever you find podcasts. For Amie, Tom, Aaron, Todd, and our producer, Katie, I'm James Lynch. Thanks for listening. Stay well.
I'd like to welcome you to the show. Mike Hand Recording's crew. Running things around here, just act like you knew. What? Imperfekt. It started with the microphone in my right hand and evolved into a newly label called Mike Hand Recordings. Reporting from Cedar Rapids, IA. Inner city, jump, skip, and I hop from the highway. That's where I stayed before the days of the flood, before the city was covered in muck and everybody's stuff littered the streets. I'm speaking literally. We had 6 feet of water in the kitchen at least. But that's enough on that subject, cause it'll get me upset. And I don't think you wanna see a grown man cry. In the city of 5 seasons, even more smells. It ain't hard to tell, people around here are bored as hell. Getting psyched for Saturdays when they're super fresh. Small place, big dreams on the road to success. Mike and the crew, the cause, collective. Midwest indigenous MCs respected. From near to